My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm 65 years old. For 40 years, I called Sacramento, California home, sharing a modest 3-bedroom house with my husband Robert on Maple Street. Until 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. A retired elementary school teacher, a devoted wife, and the proud mother of our only son, Michael. I thought I understood my life, my family, and my place in this world. I was wrong about everything. Let me take you back to the beginning, before my world shattered into a million pieces at my husband's funeral, before I discovered that the people I loved most had been plotting against me for months, before I learned that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come from those closest to your heart. Robert and I met in 1982 at a local community center dance. He was 28, working as an accountant for a small firm downtown, and I was 25, fresh out of my teaching credential program. He asked me to dance to Endless Love by Diana Ross and Lionel Richie, and I still remember how his hands trembled slightly when he placed them on my waist. We were both shy, both careful with our hearts, but something clicked that night. 6 months later, he proposed during a picnic at McKinley Park, dropping to one knee right beside the rose garden where we'd had our first real conversation. Our early years were simple but beautiful. We saved every penny for our down payment, finally buying our little house on Maple Street in 1985. It needed work. The kitchen cabinets were avocado green, the carpet was orange shag, and the bathroom had pink tiles that belonged in the 1960s. But it was ours. We spent weekends at Home Depot learning how to install flooring and paint walls. Robert would measure everything twice, then 3 times, while I'd stand there holding the level, both of us covered in sawdust and laughing at our amateur attempts at home improvement. Michael came along in 1988, and our little house suddenly felt like a palace. Robert converted the spare bedroom into a nursery, spending hours assembling the crib and painting the walls a soft yellow since we decided to wait and be surprised about the gender. I'll never forget the night Michael was born. Robert cried harder than I did when the doctor placed our son in his arms. "Look what we made, Maggie," he whispered, using the nickname only he was allowed to call me. "Look at this perfect little person." Those early years with Michael were everything I'd dreamed motherhood would be. He was a curious child, always asking why about everything, from why the sky was blue to why some people had different colored skin. I'd spend hours explaining the world to him, watching his little face light up with understanding. Robert would come home from work and immediately get down on the floor to play with Michael, building block towers, reading stories with different voices for each character, teaching him to throw a baseball in our small backyard. As Michael grew, he remained close to both of us. He was one of those kids who actually enjoyed spending time with his parents. Friday nights were movie nights. We'd make popcorn and let Michael pick the film, usually ending up with something animated that had us all singing along to catchy songs. Saturdays were for family projects around the house, and Sundays we'd drive to different places around Northern California. Apple orchards in the fall, beaches in the summer, mountain lakes in the spring. When Michael graduated high school in 2006, he chose Sacramento State so he could stay close to home. "Why would I want to go far away when I have everything I need right here?" he'd say when friends teased him about being a mama's boy. He studied business, planning to eventually take over a local company where Robert had connections. Everything felt like it was falling into place perfectly. But then Michael met Sarah in his junior year, and things began to change. Don't get me wrong, I liked Sarah at first. She was pretty, ambitious, studying pre-law with dreams of becoming a prosecutor. But I noticed that Michael started spending less time at home, missing our Friday movie nights, skipping Sunday adventures. When I'd mention it, Robert would just say, "Maggie, he's growing up. This is what's supposed to happen." They married in 2011, a beautiful ceremony at the Hyatt Regency downtown. I helped Sarah plan every detail, from the flower arrangements to the seating chart. Michael seemed happy, and that's all that mattered to me. They moved into a condo across town, and our weekly dinners became monthly, then eventually just holidays and special occasions. The marriage lasted 5 years. When they divorced in 2016, Michael was 38 and seemed lost. He moved back home with us for a few months, sleeping in his old bedroom that still had his high school baseball trophies on the shelves. Those months reminded me of the old days, the three of us having breakfast together, watching the news, sharing stories about our days. Robert and I thought maybe the divorce, as sad as it was, might bring our son back to us. But something had changed in Michael during those years with Sarah. He'd become more distant, more critical of small things. He'd make comments about how Robert and I were set in our ways, or how we needed to update our thinking about money and investments. He started talking about real estate investments, retirement planning, and financial security in ways that felt foreign coming from the little boy who used to build blanket forts in our living room. By 2018, Michael had moved into his own apartment and was working for a tech startup downtown. He seemed successful, driving a newer car and wearing expensive clothes, but our relationship felt strained in ways I couldn't quite identify. Our phone calls became shorter, his visits less frequent. When I'd ask about his life, his dating, his work, his answers felt rehearsed, like he was telling me what he thought I wanted to hear rather than sharing his real experiences. Robert noticed it too, though he tried to hide his disappointment. I'd catch him staring at his phone sometimes, waiting for Michael to call or text back. "Maybe we were too close when he was young," Robert would say. "Maybe he needs space to figure out who he is as an adult." But I could hear the hurt in his voice, see it in the way his shoulders sagged when another Sunday passed without a visit from our son. The first real red flag came in early 2023, about 8 months before Robert passed away. Michael started asking strange questions during our rare phone conversations. Questions about our finances, our retirement accounts, our plans for the house. "Mom, have you and Dad thought about what you'd do if one of you got sick? Do you have long-term care insurance? What about a will? Is everything updated?" At first I thought it showed maturity, a son concerned about his aging parents. Robert had just turned 67, and I was 64. It seemed reasonable that Michael would worry about our future, but the questions became more specific, more persistent. He wanted to know about our bank accounts, our mortgage status, the current value of our house. When I'd try to deflect, "Oh, honey, Dad and I have everything handled," he'd press harder. "Mom, I'm just trying to help. You and Dad aren't getting any younger, and I want to make sure you're protected if something happens." The words were right, but something about his tone felt off. There was an urgency that didn't match the casual nature of our conversation, an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Then Robert started getting sick. It began with shortness of breath during his morning walks, fatigue that wasn't explained by his usual activities. In March 2023, our doctor diagnosed him with congestive heart failure. Not immediately life-threatening, Dr. Patterson assured us, but something that would require medication, lifestyle changes, and careful monitoring. That's when everything started to shift in ways I didn't understand at the time. Michael suddenly became much more attentive, calling every few days to check on Robert's condition. But instead of talking to his father directly, he'd ask me detailed questions about Robert's medications, his doctor's appointments, his mental state. Is Dad confused at all? Is he having trouble making decisions? Maybe I should come over and help you organize his medications. I was grateful for Michael's renewed interest, even if it took Robert's illness to bring it about. But Robert seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "He's asking too many questions, Maggie," Robert would say after I'd relay Michael's latest concerns. "I'm sick, not incompetent. Why does he need to know every detail about my medical care?" Around the same time, Robert started getting phone calls from someone he identified as a financial advisor. At first, he'd take these calls in the living room, but gradually he began stepping outside or going into our bedroom to talk privately. When I'd ask about them, he'd wave dismissively. "Just someone helping me understand our retirement options better. You don't need to worry about the boring financial stuff." But I did worry. Robert had always included me in every major decision throughout our marriage. We'd chosen our car together, our insurance policies together, even our grocery store together. This new secretiveness felt completely unlike the man I'd been married to for 40 years. The phone calls became more frequent through the summer of 2023. Sometimes I'd hear Robert's voice rising in what sounded like frustration or confusion. Once I heard him say, "But Margaret doesn't know about any of this. I can't make these kinds of decisions without talking to her first." The response must have been convincing, because these private conversations continued for months. In September, Michael visited for dinner, the first time he'd been to our house in nearly 3 months. Instead of the casual family meal I'd hoped for, it felt like a business meeting. Michael had a folder with him, full of papers he spread across our dining room table. "Dad, I've been working with a financial advisor who specializes in helping families plan for medical emergencies," he announced. "She's helped me understand some options that could really protect Mom if something happens to you." Robert looked uncomfortable but interested. The papers Michael showed us were confusing. Something about transferring assets to protect them from potential medical bills, ensuring I'd be taken care of if Robert's condition worsened. Michael spoke with authority about concepts I'd never heard of: asset protection trusts, Medicaid planning, estate preservation strategies. "The most important thing," Michael emphasized, "is making sure Mom doesn't lose the house if Dad needs expensive medical care. There are ways to restructure ownership that would protect everything you've worked for." He pushed a business card across the table. "This is Rachel Davis, the advisor I've been working with. She specializes in exactly these kinds of situations." I picked up the card. Rachel Davis, estate planning specialist. The address was local, the credentials looked legitimate. But something about the whole conversation felt rushed, like Michael was trying to convince us of something before we had time to think it through. "Honey," I said carefully, "this is a lot to process. Can your father and I take some time to discuss this privately?" Michael's face flashed with what looked like annoyance, quickly replaced by understanding. "Of course, Mom, but don't wait too long. These kinds of protections take time to put in place, and Dad's condition could change quickly." He gathered his papers efficiently. "Rachel is really the expert here. She's helped dozens of families in situations just like yours." After Michael left that night, Robert and I sat at our kitchen table, trying to make sense of what we'd heard. "Do you think we need this kind of planning?" I asked. Robert shrugged, looking tired in a way that went beyond his physical condition. "I don't know, Maggie. Maybe Michael's right. Maybe I haven't been thinking far enough ahead about what could happen to you if I get sicker." He rubbed his forehead. "This financial advisor, Rachel, she's been calling me for a few weeks. Michael gave her my number. She knows a lot about our situation." "Our situation? What does she know about our situation?" The question came out sharper than I intended. "Just our basic information: the house, our savings, my medical diagnosis." Michael thought it would be helpful for her to understand our circumstances before she made recommendations. Robert's explanation sounded reasonable, but it made me uneasy. Why was a stranger discussing our private financial information? Over the next few weeks, Robert's conversations with Rachel became even more frequent. Sometimes he'd be on the phone with her for an hour or more, always in private, always followed by a phone call with Michael. When I'd ask what they were discussing, Robert's answers became increasingly vague. "Just exploring options, sweetheart. Making sure we're prepared for whatever comes next." But his explanations felt rehearsed, like he was repeating talking points rather than sharing his genuine thoughts. Then came the night in November when I couldn't sleep and went to the kitchen for some water. I found Robert at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of him, a pen in his hand. In the dim light, I could see official-looking documents with our names at the top. "Robert, what are you doing up so late?" He startled, quickly gathering the papers against his chest. "Oh, just reviewing some of those documents Rachel sent over, insurance stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." But his body language suggested otherwise. His hands were shaking slightly and he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Can I see them? If they're about insurance, I should probably understand what we're signing up for." I reached for the papers, but Robert pulled them away. "Maggie, please. I've got this handled. You trust me, don't you?" The question felt like emotional manipulation, like he was using our 40-year marriage to avoid transparency about something important. "Of course I trust you. That's exactly why I want to understand what's happening. We've always made big decisions together." I kept my voice gentle but firm. Robert looked at the papers in his hands, then back at me. For a moment, I thought he was going to share everything. Instead, he folded the documents and put them in the kitchen drawer. "You're right. Let me organize everything properly and we'll go through it together this weekend." But that weekend never came. Robert kept postponing our financial conversation, claiming he needed to get clearer on the details before involving me. Meanwhile, his health was declining more rapidly. Dr. Patterson increased his medications and started talking about more aggressive treatment options. The last normal conversation I had with Michael was in December, about 3 weeks before Robert passed away. I called to invite him for Christmas dinner, hoping we could return to some of our old family traditions. His response shocked me. "Mom, I don't think that's a good idea this year. Dad's condition is pretty serious, and I think you're in denial about how much help you're going to need soon." His tone was cold, clinical, like he was delivering a diagnosis rather than talking to his mother. "What do you mean, denial? I'm taking excellent care of your father. Dr. Patterson says he's stable on his current medications." "Mom, I've been talking to Dad regularly. He's told me how overwhelmed you are, how you're struggling to manage his care and the household responsibilities. Maybe it's time to start thinking about getting professional help." I was stunned. Robert had never expressed feeling overwhelmed by my care. If anything, he'd been grateful for my attention, my cooking, my company during his recovery periods. "Michael, I think there's been some miscommunication. Your father and I are managing just fine." "Are you, though?" "Dad's worried about you, Mom. He thinks you're taking on too much, trying to handle things you're not equipped for. He's concerned about your own health, your ability to make good decisions under stress." The conversation felt surreal, like Michael was describing a completely different family than the one I was living with. "Honey, I think you've misunderstood something your father said. We should all sit down together and—" "Mom, stop. Just stop trying to control everything. Dad and I have been discussing options that would be better for everyone. You need to trust that we know what we're doing." That phrase, "Dad and I have been discussing," hit me like a physical blow. When had my husband and son started making plans that didn't include me? When had I become the problem that needed to be managed rather than the partner and mother who devoted her life to caring for both of them? The line went quiet for a long moment. Then Michael's voice softened slightly. "Look, Mom, I love you. We both love you. That's exactly why we need to make sure you're protected and taken care of properly. Just trust us, okay?" But as I hung up the phone that day, trust felt like the one thing I was rapidly losing. Something was happening in my family, something that involved private phone calls, secret documents, and decisions being made without my input. I had no idea that in just 3 weeks, I'd discover exactly how deep the deception went, or how much I'd underestimated the people I thought I knew better than anyone in the world. When Robert died on January 15, 2024, I thought grief would be my biggest challenge. I had no idea that betrayal was waiting right behind it, dressed up in a dark suit and walking arm in arm with a stranger who would claim to be more family to my husband than I'd ever been. The morning of Robert's funeral arrived gray and cold, typical for January in Sacramento. I'd been awake since 4 a.m., unable to sleep, going through the motions of getting ready for the worst day of my life. The black dress I'd chosen hung loose on my frame. I'd lost 15 pounds in the 3 weeks since Robert passed, unable to eat much more than toast and soup. St. Mary's Catholic Church had been our parish for 35 years. Father Martinez, who'd married Robert and me back in 1982, would be conducting the service. We'd planned most of the details together during Robert's final weeks. his favorite hymns, readings from scripture that had comforted us during difficult times, a simple wooden casket that reflected his practical nature. I arrived at the church 2 hours early, needing time to sit quietly with Robert before the service began. The funeral home had done a beautiful job. Robert looked peaceful, younger somehow, wearing the navy blue suit he'd worn to Michael's wedding. I'd placed his favorite photo of the three of us, taken during a family camping trip to Lake Tahoe when Michael was 12, in his hands, along with a letter I'd written, telling him everything I wished I'd said while he was still alive. "I kept all my promises to you," I whispered, adjusting his tie one final time. "I loved you faithfully for 40 years. I took care of you through sickness. I honored our vows until death parted us. I just wish I understood what happened at the end, why you felt you couldn't trust me with whatever decisions you were making." By 2 o'clock, people began arriving for the 3 o'clock service. Robert's former colleagues from the accounting firm, neighbors from Maple Street, members of our church community, teachers I'd worked with during my 30-year career. About 50 people total. A respectable gathering for a man who'd lived a quiet, decent life. I positioned myself in the front pew, saving space beside me for Michael. Despite everything that had felt strange in recent months, I assumed that today, of all days, my son would be there to support me through the most difficult moment of my life. We'd buried his father together, lean on each other, begin the process of healing our family. By 2:45, Michael still hadn't arrived. I checked my phone, no messages, no missed calls. I asked Father Martinez to wait a few extra minutes, certain there must be traffic or some other simple explanation for the delay. At 3:15, 15 minutes after the scheduled start time, I finally told Father Martinez to begin. Maybe Michael was running late, but would slip in during the opening hymns. I kept glancing toward the back of the church, expecting to see him hurrying down the aisle with an apologetic wave. But when the church doors opened during Amazing Grace, what I saw made no sense at all. Michael walked in, but he wasn't alone, and he wasn't hurrying apologetically toward the front pew where his mother sat grieving. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, his arm linked with a woman I'd never seen before. She was about 45 with short blonde hair and a black dress that looked expensive. She carried herself with confidence, like she belonged there, like she had every right to be walking arm in arm with my son at my husband's funeral. Michael's face was set in an expression I didn't recognize. Cold, determined, almost defiant. The entire congregation turned to watch as they made their way down the aisle. I could hear whispers starting behind me, confused murmurs about who this woman might be. My heart began pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it echoing through the sanctuary. Michael and the woman took seats in the third pew, directly behind me but not beside me, close enough that I could hear them whispering to each other during Father Martinez's opening prayers, but far enough away to make it clear that whatever they were doing, it didn't involve including me. I tried to focus on the service, on honoring Robert's memory, on the beautiful words Father Martinez was speaking about love and eternal rest, but my mind kept spinning with questions. Who was this woman? Why was she here? Why hadn't Michael told me he was bringing someone? Why weren't they sitting with me? During the scripture readings, I heard the woman whisper something to Michael that sounded like, "Are you ready for this?" Michael nodded, his jaw tight with what looked like nervous determination. Ready for what? What was happening at my husband's funeral that required preparation? When Father Martinez invited anyone who wanted to share memories of Robert to come forward, I expected the usual stories from colleagues and friends. Instead, Michael stood up. "I'd like to say something about my father," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. But as he walked to the podium, the woman stood up too, moving to stand beside him. My stomach dropped. Whatever was about to happen, I knew instinctively that it was going to destroy everything I thought I understood about my life. Michael cleared his throat and looked directly at me for the first time since entering the church. His eyes held no warmth, no grief, no connection to the mother who'd raised him for 35 years. "Before we say goodbye to Robert Thompson," Michael began, his voice steady and formal, "I think it's important that everyone here understands the complete truth about who he was and what he meant to the people who truly knew him." The church fell completely silent. Even Father Martinez looked confused, unsure whether to interrupt or allow Michael to continue. "My father was a good man," Michael continued, "but he was also a man who lived with secrets, with relationships that some people in this room were never told about." He gestured toward the woman beside him. "I want to introduce you all to Rachel Davis." My blood turned to ice. Rachel Davis, the financial advisor, the woman who'd been calling Robert, the person behind all those private conversations and secret documents. "Rachel wasn't just Dad's financial advisor," Michael said, his voice growing stronger. "She was the real woman in my father's life. She was the person he trusted with his deepest concerns, his real plans for the future, and honestly, she's been more of a mother to me than anyone else in this family." The words hit me like physical blows. I gripped the edge of the pew so hard my knuckles turned white. Around me, I could hear gasps, uncomfortable shifting, the sound of people trying to process what they were hearing. Dad spent the last months of his life making sure that the people who truly mattered to him would be taken care of after he was gone, Michael continued. He made arrangements to ensure that his real family, the people who understood him and supported his actual wishes, would be protected. Rachel stepped forward slightly, her hand resting supportively on Michael's shoulder. She looked directly at me with what seemed like pity mixed with triumph. "So while we're here to mourn Robert Thompson's passing," Michael concluded, "I want everyone to know that his legacy will live on through the people who really knew him, who really loved him, and who really deserved his trust." As Michael walked back toward the pews, he stopped directly in front of me. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a white envelope with my name written across the front in his handwriting. "This is for you, Mom," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire church to hear. "Dad wanted you to have this today." I took the envelope with trembling hands, my mind reeling from everything I'd just heard. Around me, the congregation sat in stunned silence, clearly as confused and shocked as I was. "The house isn't yours anymore," Michael said quietly, but still audibly. "It's going to the person who deserves it." He turned and walked back to sit with Rachel, leaving me holding an envelope that felt like it contained the end of my world. Father Martinez, clearly unsure how to proceed, gently suggested we continue with the planned hymns and prayers. But for the rest of the service, I sat in a fog of shock and confusion, unable to process what had just happened or what might be waiting for me in the envelope I clutched in my shaking hands. After the final blessing, people began filing out of the church. A few neighbors and friends approached me with concerned expressions, clearly wanting to ask about what they'd witnessed, but not knowing how to broach such a delicate subject. "Margaret, dear, are you all right?" asked Helen Morrison, our next-door neighbor for 20 years. "That was, unexpected." I nodded numbly, unable to form words that would explain something I didn't understand myself. Michael and Rachel walked past me without a word, without a goodbye, without any acknowledgement that we'd just buried the husband and father who'd connected us for 35 years. At the church doors, I saw Rachel take Michael's arm again, guiding him toward a car I didn't recognize. As they drove away, I was left standing in the church parking lot, holding an envelope that might contain the answers to questions I'd never thought to ask, the same envelope that would, within hours, reveal just how thoroughly my family had betrayed me and how carefully they'd planned my destruction. But it would also be the beginning of my discovery that sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who give you the greatest motivation to prove them wrong. That evening, alone in the house that had been my home for 38 years, I sat at the kitchen table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals and opened the envelope that would change everything. Inside were 3 documents that made my blood run cold. The first was a quitclaim deed, transferring ownership of our house from Robert Thompson to Michael Thompson, dated 6 weeks before Robert's death. Robert's signature was notarized, official, and completely devastating. The second document transferred ownership from Michael Thompson to Rachel Davis, dated just 1 week ago, 1 week after Robert's funeral. Michael had signed away the house I'd called home for nearly 4 decades to a woman I'd never met. The third document was an eviction notice, giving me 30 days to vacate the premises. At the bottom of the papers, Michael had written a note in his careful handwriting. Mom, Dad wanted to make sure his assets went to people who would use them responsibly. Rachel has helped our family understand what's really best for everyone. You'll be better off starting fresh, somewhere you can afford on your own. Worse, I read those words over and over, trying to make sense of how the son I'd raised, the husband I'd loved, could have orchestrated something so cruel. 40 years of marriage, 35 years of motherhood, reduced to a note about starting fresh, somewhere I could afford. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I walked through every room of our house, touching furniture Robert and I had chosen together, looking at photos of family vacations and birthday parties and graduations. How had this home, filled with decades of memories, become something that could be signed away to a stranger without my knowledge? The next morning, I was making coffee and trying to figure out who to call first. A lawyer, maybe? Or our bank? Or Michael himself to demand an explanation, when the doorbell rang. Standing on my front porch was a uniformed court officer holding an official-looking folder. "Margaret Thompson?" he asked, his voice professional but kind. "Yes. I'm Officer Williams with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department. I have an eviction notice to serve you regarding this property." He handed me the folder with a sympathetic expression. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I know this must be very difficult." I took the papers, my hands steadier now than they'd been the day before. Something about seeing this final, official confirmation of my situation had moved me past shock into something else entirely. "Officer Williams," I said calmly, "can I ask you a question?" "Of course, ma'am." "In your experience, when families go through legal disputes like this, do things usually end up the way they first appear?" He looked at me with interest, clearly not expecting such a composed response from someone being evicted from their home of 38 years. "Well, ma'am, that's hard to say, but I will tell you this. In my 15 years serving these kinds of notices, the cases that seem the most cut and dried at the beginning are often the ones that surprise everyone by the end." I smiled for the first time since Robert's funeral. "Officer Williams, I think you might be exactly right about that." After he left, I sat down at my kitchen table with a notepad and began making a list. Not a list of things to pack or places to move, but a list of questions that needed answers. Who exactly was Rachel Davis? How long had she known Robert? When did Michael first meet her? What other documents had Robert signed that I didn't know about? Were the signatures on these papers really Robert's? What did Rachel gain from getting our house? Why was Michael cooperating with her? What had they told him about me to convince him this was right? As I wrote, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. For too long, I'd been reacting to situations I didn't understand, accepting explanations that didn't make sense, trusting people who were apparently lying to me. That was about to change. I picked up the phone and dialed information. Yes, I need the number for private investigators in Sacramento. It was time to start getting some answers. 3 days later, I was sitting in the office of Jim Rodriguez, a private investigator who specialized in elder abuse and family fraud cases. His office was small and cluttered, but his credentials were impressive. 20 years with the Sacramento Police Department specializing in financial crimes before starting his own practice. "Mrs. Thompson," he said after reviewing the documents I'd brought, "I have to tell you, cases like this are becoming increasingly common. Elder abuse through financial manipulation is one of the fastest growing crimes in America. So you think that's what happened? That my husband was manipulated?" I think it's very possible. Tell me about Rachel Davis. What do you know about her background? Almost nothing. Michael said she was a financial advisor who specialized in helping families plan for medical emergencies. She had business cards, seemed professional. She knew details about our finances that I never told her. Jim made notes on a yellow legal pad. How long was she in contact with your husband? At least 6 months, maybe longer. They talked on the phone regularly, always privately. Robert said she was helping him understand our retirement options. And your son. When did his attitude toward you start changing? I thought carefully about that question. It was gradual, but it really accelerated after Robert got sick. Michael started asking lots of questions about our finances, our plans, our legal documents. Then he started suggesting that I was overwhelmed, that Robert was worried about my ability to handle decisions. Jim nodded grimly. Classic isolation tactics. They convince the victim that family members can't be trusted, that they're the only ones who really understand the situation. He leaned forward. Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to be very direct with you. If Rachel Davis is what I think she is, your husband was the victim of a sophisticated con game, and your son was likely manipulated just as much as your husband was. What do you mean? Professional con artists who target elderly people usually work in teams. They identify vulnerable individuals, people who are sick, isolated, or worried about their family's futures. Then they create elaborate stories designed to turn family members against each other. He pulled a file from his desk drawer. I've worked 3 similar cases in the last 2 years. Each time, the con artist convinced an elderly person that their spouse or children were planning to take advantage of them. They provided fake evidence, forged documents, staged conversations, whatever it took to create distrust within the family. You think Rachel might have done something like that? I think it's very possible. Let me ask you this. Did your husband's personality change in the months before he died? Did he become more secretive, more suspicious, more worried about things that had never bothered him before? I thought about Robert's behavior in those final months, the private phone calls, the secret documents, his reluctance to include me in financial discussions that had always been shared decisions. Yes, I said quietly. He did change. He became someone I didn't recognize. And your son? Has he ever shown signs of being easily influenced by others? Has he made decisions in the past that seemed out of character when he was in a relationship or under pressure? I thought about Michael's marriage to Sarah, how his priorities had shifted during those years, how he'd sometimes seemed to echo her opinions rather than expressing his own thoughts. Yes, that describes him perfectly. He's always been somewhat impressionable, especially when he admires someone or feels like they have expertise he lacks. Jim made more notes. Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to investigate Rachel Davis's background, her business practices, her history with other clients. I'd also like to look into the legal documents your husband signed, verify signatures, check notarization, confirm that proper procedures were followed. How much would something like that cost? For a thorough investigation, probably around $2,000. I know that's a lot of money, especially given your current situation. I thought about the small savings account I'd maintained separately from our joint accounts, money I'd saved from birthday gifts and small teaching bonuses over the years. It was supposed to be for emergencies. If this wasn't an emergency, nothing was. Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to find out everything you can about Rachel Davis and what really happened to my family. As I wrote him a check, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Robert died. Hope. Not hope that things would go back to the way they were, but hope that I might finally understand what had happened and why. 2 weeks later, Jim Rodriguez called me with news that would change everything I thought I knew about the woman who'd stolen my home and destroyed my family. When Jim Rodriguez called me on February 12th, exactly 4 weeks after Robert's funeral, I could hear the excitement in his voice before he even began speaking. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to sit down for this conversation. What I've discovered about Rachel Davis is far worse than either of us imagined." I was already sitting at my kitchen table, the same spot where I'd opened that devastating envelope, surrounded by copies of all the legal documents and a notebook filled with questions I'd been accumulating for weeks. "I'm ready, Mr. Rodriguez. Tell me everything." First, Rachel Davis isn't just a financial advisor who got carried away helping your family. She's a professional con artist with a very specific method of operation. Over the past 8 years, she's targeted at least 6 elderly men in Northern California, and your husband was her 7th victim. My hands tightened around the phone. 7 victims? 7 that I've been able to document so far. Each case follows an almost identical pattern. Rachel identifies elderly men with significant assets who are dealing with serious health issues. She approaches them through what appears to be legitimate financial planning services, gains their trust, then systematically isolates them from their families while convincing them that their spouses or children are trying to take advantage of them. How does she do that? She's incredibly sophisticated, Mrs. Thompson. She creates fake evidence, doctored photographs, forged documents, staged conversations. In your husband's case, I believe she convinced him that you were having an affair and planning to divorce him to take half his assets. She probably showed him fake bank records suggesting you were hiding money, fake legal documents suggesting you'd consulted a divorce attorney. The words hit me like a physical blow. Poor Robert, sick and vulnerable, believing his wife of 40 years was betraying him. No wonder he'd become secretive and distant. What about Michael? How did she get him involved? That's where it gets even more disturbing. Rachel has been cultivating a relationship with your son for over 10 months, not the 8 months we initially thought. She approached him last spring with fake evidence that you were financially abusing your husband, doctored bank statements showing you withdrawing large amounts of money, fake medical reports suggesting you were giving Robert wrong medications, even edited audio recordings of conversations that made you sound greedy and manipulative. Audio recordings? How could she have recordings of conversations in my own home? Mrs. Thompson, Rachel Davis is not working alone. She has a network of accomplices, people who install listening devices, create false documents, even pose as medical professionals when necessary. This is organized crime, not a simple case of financial elder abuse. I felt sick thinking about strangers listening to private conversations between Robert and me, editing them to make me sound like a villain in my own life. "The pattern is always the same," Jim continued. "She turns the victim against their spouse, then recruits the adult children as allies by convincing them they're protecting their parent from abuse. By the time she's ready to take the assets, the family has been completely destroyed from the inside." How much money are we talking about? From all her victims? Over $2.3 million in assets stolen over 8 years. Houses, savings accounts, life insurance policies, investment portfolios. And here's the most shocking part. She doesn't just disappear with the money, she actually moves into the victims' homes for a period of time, living off their assets while looking for her next target. She's living in my house? Not yet, but that was almost certainly the plan. Michael was supposed to sign the house over to her. She'd move in as your husband's grieving partner, and you'd be left with nothing while she enjoyed the home you and Robert built together. The audacity was breathtaking. This woman hadn't just stolen our assets. She'd planned to steal our entire life, literally moving into our space and erasing our 40-year history. "Mr. Rodriguez, what happened to the other families, the other victims?" His voice grew somber. 3 of the elderly men died under suspicious circumstances, while Rachel was managing their care. All 3 had their medications changed shortly before their deaths, changes that weren't authorized by their doctors. The implication was clear, and it made my blood run cold. You think she might have accelerated their deaths? I think it's very possible. And Mrs. Thompson, I found something in your husband's medical records that you need to know about. Robert's heart medication was changed twice in his final month, changes that aren't in his official medical file and weren't ordered by Dr. Patterson. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles were white. The possibility that Rachel had not only stolen from us but had actually hastened Robert's death was almost too horrible to contemplate. There's more, Jim continued. Rachel Davis isn't even her real name. Her birth name is Rachel Martinez. She's been divorced 3 times, and each divorce settlement involved suspicious circumstances where her ex-husbands lost far more assets than the law typically allows. How is she getting away with this? Why isn't she in prison? Because she's extremely careful about jurisdiction and evidence. She moves between counties, uses accomplices for the actual document fraud, and by the time families figure out what happened, she's already moved on to the next victim. Most importantly, she's very good at making everything look legal. What do you mean? The documents your husband signed were technically valid. The notarizations were real, done by accomplices who are actual notaries. The signatures appear genuine because Robert actually signed them. He just did it based on false information about your intentions and your family's situation. I felt a mixture of relief and rage. Relief that Robert hadn't willingly betrayed me, rage that he'd been manipulated so thoroughly that he'd signed away our home, while believing he was protecting me. The good news, Jim said, is that fraud based on deliberate deception can be challenged in court, especially when we can prove a pattern of similar behavior with other victims. I've been in contact with 3 of the other families, and they're willing to testify about Rachel's methods. What about Michael? Is he facing legal trouble? That depends on how much he knew and when he knew it. If he was genuinely convinced you were abusing your husband, and if he believed he was protecting his father, then he might be considered another victim. But if he knowingly participated in defrauding you, I don't think Michael knew it was fraud, I said, surprising myself by defending the son who'd humiliated me at his father's funeral. He's always been easily influenced by people he perceives as experts. If Rachel convinced him I was dangerous, he would have believed her completely. Mrs. Thompson, there's something else. Rachel is planning to sell your house within the next 2 weeks. Once that happens, recovering the asset becomes much more complicated. We need to move fast. What are our options? I've been working with an attorney who specializes in elder abuse cases, Sarah Wilson. She believes we can get an emergency injunction to stop the sale based on the evidence of fraud and the pattern with other victims. But we'll need to move quickly, and we'll need Michael's cooperation. Michael won't even talk to me. He will after he sees what I'm about to show him. 2 days later, I found myself in the most surreal situation of my life, sitting in a downtown Sacramento law office with Michael across from me, both of us staring at a table covered with evidence that would destroy everything he thought he knew about the past year. Attorney Sarah Wilson had arranged the meeting, telling Michael only that there were serious legal issues with the property transfer that required his immediate attention. He'd arrived looking annoyed and impatient, clearly expecting another delay in Rachel's plans. Michael, Sarah began, before we discuss the legal issues, I want you to look at some information Mr. Rodriguez has gathered about Rachel Davis. Jim slid a thick folder across the table. This contains documentation about 6 other families Rachel has defrauded using identical methods to what she used with your parents. Michael opened the folder skeptically, but as he began reading, his expression changed from annoyance to confusion to horror. "This can't be right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel showed me evidence that she was stealing from Dad, giving him wrong medications, planning to leave him." "Can you show us that evidence?" Sarah asked gently. Michael pulled out his phone and scrolled through saved photos. Bank statements, medical documents, what appeared to be legal paperwork. Jim examined each one carefully. "Michael, these documents are forgeries. This bank statement shows withdrawals from an account that was actually closed 3 years ago. This medical report is allegedly from Dr. Patterson. But look at the letterhead. The address is wrong, and Dr. Patterson's medical license number is off by 2 digits. But the recordings— Michael's voice was getting smaller. Rachel played me recordings of Mom talking about hiding money, about getting Dad declared incompetent. Those were edited, Jim explained. Voice editing software can take pieces of different conversations and splice them together to create entirely new sentences. Rachel is an expert at this kind of evidence manipulation. I watched my son's face as the reality settled in. 35 years old, and he looked like a child who'd just realized he'd been lied to by someone he trusted completely. "Mom," he said, turning to me with tears in his eyes, "I thought I was protecting Dad from you. Rachel showed me all this evidence, and it seemed so real." "Honey," I said, reaching across the table to touch his hand, "you were trying to do the right thing based on information you believed was true, but we need to understand something. Rachel didn't just lie to you about me. She lied to your father about me, too." Whinies, Sarah opened another folder. "Michael, we have evidence that Rachel told your father that your mother was having an affair, that she was planning to divorce him and take half his assets. She showed him fake photographs, fake legal documents, fake evidence that made him believe his wife of 40 years was betraying him." Michael put his head in his hands. "Oh God, Dad died thinking Mom was cheating on him. He died thinking his own wife was stealing from him." "I'm afraid so," Sarah said softly. "Rachel's method depends on completely destroying trust within families. She convinced your father that your mother was the enemy, and she convinced you that your mother was the enemy. Meanwhile, she positioned herself as the only person who could be trusted by either of you." "The house," Michael said suddenly. "She said she needed the house transferred to her name for legal protection, that it was temporary until we could figure out the best way to take care of Mom." "Michael," Jim said, "Rachel has done this exact same thing to 6 other families. She's stolen over $2 million in assets. She was planning to sell your family's house and disappear, just like she's done before." "Where is she now?" Michael asked. "We believe she's preparing to leave Sacramento," Sarah replied. "Our investigators have been monitoring her activities. She's been liquidating other assets, closing bank accounts, showing signs that she's getting ready to move on to her next target." Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "I have to stop this. I have to fix this somehow." "You can," Sarah said, "but we need to move quickly. Rachel is planning to complete the house sale within the next week. Once that happens, recovering the property becomes much more difficult. What do you need me to do? First, we need you to sign an affidavit stating that you were defrauded into transferring the property. Second, we need you to cooperate with the criminal investigation. And third, we need you to help us gather evidence about Rachel's activities." "Evidence? What kind of evidence?" Jim leaned forward. "We need recordings of Rachel talking about her plans, admissions about how she manipulated your family, anything that would prove criminal intent." "You want me to wear a wire?" "Actually," Sarah said, "we want you to invite Rachel to dinner, tonight, at your mother's house. We'll have the entire conversation recorded, and we'll have police positioned outside." I felt a chill of fear and excitement. After weeks of feeling helpless, we were finally going to confront the woman who destroyed my family. "Will it be dangerous?" Michael asked. "Rachel's not typically violent," Jim replied. "Her crimes are financial and psychological manipulation, but we'll have backup nearby, and the goal is simply to get her talking about her methods and her plans." Michael looked at me. "Mom, are you okay with this? With having her in your house?" "Michael, that woman has been living off our family's pain for months. She's stolen our home, destroyed our relationships, and possibly contributed to your father's death. I want to look her in the eye when she realizes her game is over." 6 hours later, I was standing in my own kitchen, cooking dinner for the woman who'd ruined my life, while police officers installed recording equipment throughout my house. The plan was simple: Michael would tell Rachel that there were some final legal documents that needed to be signed before the house sale could proceed. He'd invite her to dinner to discuss the paperwork in a relaxed setting. Once she was comfortable in talking freely, we'd gradually reveal what we knew and try to get her to admit to her fraudulent activities. At 7 o'clock, I heard a car in the driveway. Through the window, I watched Rachel Davis step out of a silver BMW, looking confident and self-assured. She was wearing designer clothes and expensive jewelry, probably purchased with money stolen from previous victims. "Mom, are you ready for this?" Michael asked, his voice tense with nerves. "I've been ready for this my entire life," I replied. "I just didn't know it until now." The doorbell rang, and Michael went to answer it. I could hear Rachel's voice in the entryway, bright and cheerful, playing the role of the helpful family friend. "Margaret," she called out as she entered the kitchen, "how are you holding up, sweetheart? I know this transition has been so difficult for you." I looked at this woman who'd spoken to my husband in private for months, who'd convinced him I was betraying him, who'd manipulated my son into believing I was an enemy. She was smaller than I'd expected, ordinary looking, with the kind of face that would be easy to forget. "I'm doing better than expected, Rachel," I said, forcing a smile. "Much better, actually." Something in my tone made her look at me more carefully, but Michael quickly distracted her by offering wine and asking about the paperwork they needed to review. As we sat down to eat, Rachel launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed performance about how difficult this situation must be for everyone, how she was just trying to honor Robert's wishes, how she hoped we could all remain friends despite the unfortunate circumstances. "Rachel," I said during a pause in her monologue, "I'm curious about something. How exactly did you meet my husband?" "Oh, it was at a financial planning seminar downtown. Robert was asking such thoughtful questions about protecting assets during medical emergencies. I could tell he was a man who really cared about his family's security." "And when you started advising him, did he mention that he'd been married for 40 years? That we'd always made financial decisions together?" Rachel's smile flickered slightly. "Well, yes, but Robert was concerned that you were overwhelmed by his medical situation. He felt like he needed someone objective to help him think through his options." "Objective?" I repeated. "Is that what you'd call someone who shows a sick man fake evidence that his wife is cheating on him?" The color drained from Rachel's face. "I'm sorry, what?" Michael set down his fork. "Rachel, we know about the other families. We know about the fake documents. We know about your real name, Rachel Martinez." For a moment, Rachel looked like she might try to continue the charade. Then her expression hardened, and I saw the real person underneath the helpful advisor persona. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said coldly. "Robert came to me because he was worried about his family's financial future. Everything I did was completely legal." "Legal, maybe," I said, "but not honest. You convinced my husband that I was betraying him. You showed him forged documents, edited recordings, fake evidence designed to make him distrust the woman he'd been married to for 40 years. Robert was a grown man who made his own decisions based on the information available to him," Rachel replied, her voice growing sharper. "If he chose to protect his assets from a wife who was clearly taking advantage of his illness, that was his choice." "Taking advantage?" I stood up, anger finally overriding my fear. "I took care of that man every single day of his illness. I cooked his meals, managed his medications, drove him to every doctor's appointment. I held his hand when he was scared and sat by his bedside when he couldn't sleep. What exactly was I taking advantage of?" "Money," Rachel said bluntly. "Robert knew you were planning to leave him and take half of everything he'd worked for. He showed me the evidence himself." "What evidence? The fake bank statements you created? The forged legal documents? The edited recordings you made to turn him against me?" Rachel's mask was completely off now. "You can't prove any of that." "Actually," Michael said quietly, "we can. We have documentation of your activities with 6 other families. We have testimony from your previous victims, and we have this entire conversation on tape." Rachel's eyes darted toward the kitchen door, calculating her options. "This is entrapment. Anything recorded here won't be admissible in court." "Maybe not in criminal court," said a new voice from the kitchen doorway, "but it'll be very useful in civil court." Detective Tom Martinez walked into the kitchen, followed by 2 uniformed officers. "Rachel Martinez, also known as Rachel Davis, you're under arrest for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft." As the officers read Rachel her rights and placed her in handcuffs, she looked directly at me with pure hatred. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed. "That old man was dying anyway. I just helped him make better decisions about his assets than he would have made on his own." "My husband," I said quietly, "was a good man who loved his family. You turned him against the people who cared about him most, and you made him die believing his wife had betrayed him. That's not helping someone make better decisions. That's destroying a life." As they led Rachel away, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Robert died. Peace. Not happiness, not relief, but a deep sense that justice was finally beginning. 6 months later, I was standing in my kitchen again, but everything had changed. The house was officially mine again, the courts having ruled that all of Robert's transactions with Rachel were the result of fraud and elder abuse. Rachel was serving an 8-year sentence for her crimes against my family and others, and her network of accomplices had been dismantled by investigators. Michael was in therapy, working through the guilt of having been manipulated into betraying his own mother. Our relationship was slowly healing, built now on a foundation of honesty rather than the assumptions and expectations that had made us both vulnerable to Rachel's manipulation. "Mom," Michael said as he helped me plant new roses in the garden Robert had loved, "I keep thinking about something Rachel said that night. She said Dad was dying anyway, like that justified what she did to him." "What do you think about that?" I asked. I think she missed the point completely. Dad wasn't just dying. We all are, eventually. But the time we have matters. The relationships we build matter. The trust we share with the people we love matters. He paused, wiping dirt from his hands. She didn't just steal money from Dad. She stole his last months of peace, his ability to trust the people who loved him most. And she almost stole our relationship, too, I added. But she didn't. That's what I keep coming back to. She tried to destroy our family, but we're still here. We're still figuring out how to love each other, even after everything that happened. Michael was right. Rachel had taken our house temporarily, our money temporarily, our peace temporarily. But she hadn't been able to take the most important thing, our commitment to finding our way back to each other. That evening, as I sat in the living room where Robert and I had watched thousands of movies together, I thought about the lessons this experience had taught me. I'd learned that people I trusted completely could be deceived into betraying me. I'd learned that strangers could systematically destroy families using nothing but lies and manipulation. I'd learned that sometimes the people who claim to be helping you are actually predators looking for their next victim. But I'd also learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. I'd learned that love, real love, can survive even deliberate attempts to destroy it. I'd learned that justice might be slow, but it's not impossible. And I'd learned that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what really matters. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Jim Rodriguez. "Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to let you know that we've identified 3 more families that Rachel defrauded before she targeted your husband. The district attorney thinks we have enough evidence to file additional charges that could extend her sentence significantly." "What about the other victims? Are they getting their assets back?" 2 of the families are in the process of recovery now. The 3rd case is more complicated because the victim passed away and his family didn't realize what had happened until recently. "I want to help them," I said without hesitation. "Whatever they need, testimony, evidence, support, I want to help." I was hoping you'd say that. There's also something else. The district attorney's office wants to create an educational program about elder abuse prevention. They'd like you to consider speaking to community groups about warning signs and protection strategies. I thought about Robert, about how isolated and confused he must have felt in his final months, believing the woman he'd loved for 40 years was betraying him. I thought about other families who might be going through the same manipulation right now, other elderly people being turned against their loved ones by predators like Rachel. Mr. Rodriguez, when do we start? 3 months later, I gave my first presentation to a group of seniors at the Sacramento Community Center. I told them Robert's story, Michael's story, and my story. I explained how financial predators identify vulnerable targets, how they isolate victims from their families, how they create fake evidence to destroy trust between people who love each other. After my presentation, a woman in her 70s approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "I think someone might be doing this to my husband right now. He's been getting calls from a financial advisor, and he started saying things about me that don't make sense. He's become secretive about money, suspicious of me in ways that are completely unlike him." I took her hands in mine. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Dorothy. Dorothy Williams." "Dorothy, you came to the right place tonight. Let me give you some phone numbers. We're going to make sure your family gets the help you need before it's too late." As I helped Dorothy contact the appropriate authorities that evening, I realized something profound had happened. My experience with Rachel, as terrible as it had been, had given me a purpose I'd never had before. I wasn't just surviving what had happened to my family. I was using it to protect other families from the same devastation. That night, I called Michael to tell him about Dorothy and the help we'd been able to provide. "Mom," he said, "I'm proud of you. Dad would be proud of you, too." "I think he would be," I agreed. "I think he'd be proud of both of us for finding our way back to each other." "Do you forgive me?" Michael asked quietly. "For believing Rachel instead of trusting you?" "Honey, there's nothing to forgive. Rachel was a professional at manipulation. She made a career out of turning families against each other. The fact that we survived it, that we found our way back to the truth, that's what matters now." "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart." As I hung up the phone, I looked around the house that had been stolen from me and then returned, the home where Robert and I had built a life together and where Michael had grown up. The rooms looked the same, but everything felt different. This wasn't just the house where I'd been betrayed and almost lost everything. It was also the house where I'd found strength I didn't know I had, where I'd fought back against people who tried to destroy my family, where I'd learned that love really can conquer deception if you're willing to fight for the truth. Tomorrow I would help another family recognize the warning signs of elder abuse. Next week, I would testify in court to help convict one of Rachel's accomplices. Next month, I would speak to a group of attorneys about protecting vulnerable clients from financial predators. But tonight, I was simply Margaret Thompson, sitting in my own living room in my own house, surrounded by 40 years of memories with the husband I'd loved and the son I was learning to love in new ways. Rachel had tried to steal all of this from me. She had no idea who she was dealing with.